What's up, dude? It's me, Mr. Airon here, the Airon, the history buff here. Welcome back to another history video. So in today's topic, we're going to be going over through the Russian revolutions, Russian Revolution. So today, in which I'm going to be showing into like one of my classwork that I did, which is the Russian Revolution scramble slide presentation that I'm going to be showing you guys. Basically, what I'm going to be showing you is basically how did Russia during the First World War, well, fought it alongside with the Allies, but then again later got kicked off in 1917, and then eventually had a revolution uprising, and then later into a civil war and became a communist state here. So before we get into this video, if you guys haven't yet, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel if you're new, don't forget to comment, and turn on the bell notifications. That way you get notified by every video that I'll be posting in the channel. And yeah, so let's get started. Alright, so let's see. So basically, I'm gonna read this for you guys here. So here's a ball paper that basically goes to facts and to all the way to about that you guys need to know everything all about the Russian history. So I'm basically here gonna basically read you guys here along. So for hundreds of years over Russia that had been ruled the all-powerful Romanov family since 1613, they have controlled a giant empire. This is what the Russian flag looks like, with the Russian symbol with the flag that looks present today, except with the yellow with the coat of arms here of the dark eagle they have. When the war began in 1914, like many other countries, that was much excitement in Russia. The Romanov ruler at this time was the Tsar Nicholas II here. Nicholas had dreamt of a glorious victory and expanding his empire in Eastern Europe. To do this, he would send millions of Russians to fight the war in his name, despite some early successes against the Austrians in the war that soon went badly for the Russians here. Right, because like basically, Russia had been basically after like the Napoleonic Wars, like basically Austria had also like asked the Russians to basically fought into like basically into the Crimean War, but then like basically before Nicholas's reign, but then like basically Austria refused, and that would lead to a total Russian defeat here, and this would lead to like drain down the relationships between Russia and Austria here, which would then later have consequences. But the time then when World War One had came on, Russia was then joined into the Triple Entente alongside with England, France, Serbia, and then later Montenegro during around this war here, and that they need to like basically have a 10 days around like to need to mobilize their troops, and they declared war on Austria here because Austria declared war on Serbia because of like basically the Archduke of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, was then assassinated in Sarajevo of Bosnia, and that's why Austria Nico tried to give over the demands to Serbia, but then Serbia just simply refused to those demands here, and then Austria-Hungary then was later declared war, in which he was at Austria-Hungary by then was decided with its neighbor, the German Empire. And so and with the but for Russia they suffered again the defeats against like the Germans, such as the Battle of Tannenberg around the Masurian Lakes, where millions of Russian soldiers were killed on the top of this freezing winter of 1916 and 1917, brought food shortages in Russia. The grew black masses and grew angry that took protesting in the streets, as shown in the paint in this next painting. As anger spread to the working classes, began to question why were they beginning to stand to fight in the czar for a powerful czar while they were so poor, hungry, and they had a little. A political ideology started with a German named Karl Marx who began to gain more popularity in Russia. This is how he basically looks like right here on the top right here. Karl Marx, who basically the guy who basically he's the father who came of communism, and he came up with this communism ideals and also with Marxism, basically claiming that like basically the bad ideals of capitalism, saying that capitalism is being alienated and needs to be reformed, and also well as that workers get pay little while capitalists stay rich here, like basically people get rich and a lot of money while people will stay poor, hungry, and basically ran out of food here, and like basically basically there's corruption, and like basically Karl Marx says they need to be works here, and like because the economy needs to be a lot more profitable, and that people need to also be like productive into many of the factories and productions and industries, and when to the communist ideology here, and like basically where it's going to be that it was being controlled by the government here, and it's where they were known as communism. This was a system that says that all people should be treated equally, and that there should not be a rich or poor. Everyone should be the same. That the German government wanted to take advantage of the problems in Russia, secretly tried to make more trouble. In the February of 1917, after heavy rioting in Russia, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate in the that was what began back then known as the February Revolution, because basically, guys, Russia was basically losing behind, like basically that they were lost the battles of Tannenberg against Germany when the war had already started. That Germany had to fight on three fronts here, such as the Eastern and the Western Front against Britain and France and Belgium. So, but in the Eastern Front, when they were fighting against the Russians, alongside with their ally, the Austrians, that the Austria thought they would take over the Russia, but then the Russians went eastward, inland to Austria-Hungary, so that way Germany need to get like a lot more forces into to protect themselves from the Russians, and which they did successful in the successive battles like Tannenberg and then the Tolstoy stuff, and as well as the Austerlitz fortress here that was basically did somebody where they basically that the Germans had then launched artillery like attacks on the Russians fortress, Auschwitz fortress, and they later launched a gas attack against the Russians. Until then, when they put on their gas mask with 120,000 troops here that marched in, until the Russians had then basically fought back and basically covered their skin with even though faces covered with bandages that covered with chemical burns, and they later retreated and attacked revolted against the Russians. That became an event known as the Attack of the Dead Men, and also that in 1916 the Russians had also basically had launched the Buroslav offensive against the Austrians, and basically that they launched an offensive attack here until they went into stalemate, until they were running out of supplies, and the fighting was still continuing and had been ongoing. While Russia about that time also had been also not just Austria-Hungary and Germany, but also against the Ottoman Empire, which is in the neighbors because of they attacked the Ottomans had a navy had attacked like the Crimean Peninsula here, in which they were that war with Russia here, in which they invaded into the Ottoman territory, but then the Ottomans were not prepared for the cold here, and so they were freeze to death here, and to the Russians, while the Russians had been invaded through inland, and the Ottomans right back then before had tried to take over the Suez Canal, but that had failed. While the Allied forces like Britain, France, and the Australia and New Zealand had tried to take over to Ottoman territory and take over Constantinople for the Gallipoli campaigns, but that all had ultimately failed. But so basically with the 1917 revolution, because then like this guy named Vladimir Lenin, who basically who at that time was exiled into Switzerland, had then eventually came back to Russia, which is named arrived in Petrograd, which we would later rename to Leningrad, and then later what's today St. Petersburg. What he basically did was he basically came up with his communist ideals and read the books from Karl Marx, and basically he went to this speech in Petrograd saying peace, land, and bread, and peace all to the Soviets here in his communist ideology. While after this was like after Nicholas had abdicated, and that they later could establish like a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, who was a pure bourgeois basically family, and two, he was against the communist ideologies, against tried to overthrow Lenin, and to the challenges also to champion and fight against the monarchy until it was then backfired, in which they were then taken over and then got overthrown and replaced up with the new communist government here, and which the Russians, the communists, then the Bolsheviks, then later also stormed into the Winter Palace here. in which then like which later then also revolted, followed by a Russian civil war here, which is later led by to the communist whites and to the communist reds and to, I mean and to the white army here, in which then which resulted into the Red Army taking over the country and which victorious here, and thus the Tsar and his Nicholas and his wife and kids were both shot and stabbed to death, basically being executed. And then because by then because many of Joseph Lenin's ideas, communist ideas of workers movements and trade reforms here comes from men such as Leon Trotsky, and like later the next ruler after Lenin such as Joseph Stalin, which I'll get to him probably in another, but that's for like another future video. But in the February of 1917, after heavy rioting in Russia, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate as a new government took over Russia and made the upper classes and working classes. And this rule of new provisional government was called the dual power. The Germans hoped that the new government would agree as to a ceasefire and end the war, but it did not. But it did not. The Germans tried a new idea. They had been in a contact with the exiled communist leaders such as Vladimir Lenin. Here he is, which he's right here at the bottom at the left here, which the Germans had helped organize Lenin return to Russia, allowing his safe passage from Switzerland through Germany, and sailed train once back in Russia in Petrograd. Lenin had led a second revolution known as the October Rising in 1917, where Lenin's political party was called the Bolsheviks. His communist Red Guards took over the city in Petrograd, and Lenin said that the communist takeover for Russia was complete. From here, that Russia was named later on the Soviet Union, or the USSR was then later established in by 1922, where then and then this is what their flag looks like here, with the red, with the yellow hammer and sickle, and with the star on the top here. That the Bolsheviks had promised the Russians that they would make peace with Germany after only a few weeks in power. Fighting on Eastern Front was stopped, following a long peace conference with the new communist state government called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in with Germany. This was a very hard treaty on the Soviets, who gave up including lands such as Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, which was then occupied by the Axis forces like Germany. This was 25% of the Soviet and land, and included almost 50 million people. Take a look into predicting also into this map at the bottom here, which is taken control by Germany, also parts of like Austrian the Triple Alliance forces here, in which this was basically good news for Germany, that they now focused to maybe invasions to go against France and England, but then they later come with the allies such as the United States of America, in which America has basically by that time was trying to remain neutral during the war, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who basically sent American by sending a lot of aid, weapons, and foods and supplies towards all the Triple Entente allied forces here, and it was getting a lot stronger in morality, and it was better tough for the Germans here, and like basically, the reasons why you guys might think like why the USA might have joined the war was basically the one reason was in that back in 1917 in the North Sea, where the Germans with their Untersee boats or U-boats basically launched torpedoes and attacked the ship, the bombed over the Lusitania ship that contained over 1,213 like 15 Americans here, and that sunk the U.S. ship, and then by that naval that was used as battleships, such as later with Britain at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. That Germany had signed also the unconditional naval protection and to sea warfare throughout the North Sea. And also with another reason is why also that Germany had tried to send a telegram to Mexico to basically try to tell Mexico, his friend and allies, to basically join up Germany and try to attack the U.S. by taking over their previous territories, like Mexico had gained when after they then lost it from the previous Mexican-American War from 1846 till 1848, like such as taking over say Nevada, Nevada, California, New Mexico, or Arizona. But Mexico was by then was didn't agree with this, and because by that time we was basically facing up with many revolts and revolutions and current crises and civil wars. But then later Britain had intercepted the message and then showed this message to the American government here, and then Woodrow Wilson had no other choice, and but then asked Congress then later to declare war, in which he did, and he sent many U.S. Troops to on the onto the Western Front here, in which then Germany at the time was losing the war, and it was just bad news. And then they fought hard against the Allied forces when they were using way too many resources, while the Americans were gaining up their morale and gunfire maneuvers here. When they finally had the final punch here, and that the Americans had pushed forward, and they either launched many battles, such as in the deadly wooded forest at the Battle of Belleau Wood here, and later at the battles of the Nice here, and the third Battle of the Ypres here, which later built in Germany with artillery barrages and constant fighting and gunshots and later artillery barrages. And later, like charges that later that Germany had there was no point back, and that they were put and the Axis powers were pushed on all sides. In which then Bulgaria fell first here, and then followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and then finally Germany had then surrendered into the war here. With the treaty, they'll officially agree with Germany with the Bolsheviks, able to switch the armies in the east to help the launch a major new attack in the coast called the Ludendorff Offensive here, which is basically like one of Germany's last offensive against like many of the Allied forces. That aimed this attack was try to win the war quickly before the Americans arrived and add more power to the Allies here. But unfortunately, which led to which ultimately was unsuccessful because Germany was losing a lot of resources, and while the Allies gained a lot of morale and resources and supplies here, and maneuvers against the Germans until they were pushed all the way back here before they surrendered, and then later signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 after the war, and then the year later in the 1919, where they then signed the 1919 like Treaty of Versailles that basically forced Germany to basically lose all their colonies and like basically minimize their armed forces, and like they could not get an airfield and had to pay a huge amount of money, like $50 million in war reparations. And like basically the poor people of Germany, and that Germany at the time was losing, basically trying to print its own money here. But the problem is that regular money does not make like basically the Allies more money. It just makes money less and less valuable here. And like this basically that was time the stock market crash, the banknotes had became worthless, people were starving to death, and that's where after Germany had also established itself became known as the Weimar Republic here, which is then like you see where they tried to give all the reforms here, but then later Germany was then later took over by Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler in the end later, into which leader would then lead to the Second World War. But that's another video. But that's for another future video here. Okay, so yeah, this was basically my my whole presentation of the about the scramble of Russia here that I mentioned, and it was I actually had a lot of fun here of making this here. I actually made this actually for a school assignment that was back in like my sophomore year back in my school known as Mendel Atherton High School. And yeah, and I thought back at high school, and I thought I had like a lot of fun of making it here, like connect the pictures all in like basically through chronological orders here, which is actually pretty cool, and I've fun with it here. But yeah, I hope you guys still enjoyed the video here, and if you guys did, and you still want to see me create still more history content like this, then what are you waiting for? Please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel if you're new, don't forget to comment, and turn on the bell notifications, that way you get notified by every video that I'll be posting in the channel. And yeah, I'll probably see you guys in my next video. So, Mr. Airon's out, peace.